Good morning, this is Tyler Dawn Rosenquist of the Ancient Bridge, and this morning I'm going to take you through what do you do when you run into problems with research. And we're going to go through some of my ways of finding legitimate articles and investigating kind of what we've always just taken for granted. So, my boys and I were reading through the Bible in homeschool. We were reading Ezekiel 8, and Ezekiel 8, of course, is the big idolatry in the temple chapter. And I noticed a strange bit of problem with temple architecture because I've been taking Joseph Good's Temple Academy class, which is amazing. Let me tell you, change your life. And so, what on earth? And so I started studying it. And then I said, well, you know, maybe I ought to do a blog series on this. And I got to the point where I started studying about Tammuz, weeping for Tammuz. And went online, just for fun, even though I tell everybody not to do this. But I can do this because I know I'm going to do my homework afterwards. Started looking for information on Tammuz, and I come up with all of this information, linking him to this and that, and he's a sun god, and he's a pre-Christ Messiah figure, and he carried around a cross, and goodness sakes, let me see. I wrote down a lot of the different claims. He's a sun god, that he died and resurrected. They carried around a cross, and the women in the temple were weeping for Tammuz because he'd been killed by something. Anyway, so I said, well, okay, I need to find out for this blog series about the weeping for Tammuz. So let's get it figured out. So I was going through all these websites that were making these claims, and most of them, of course, were not footnoted, because that's the thing you find. Most people put things out there, and they don't list their sources. Sometimes that's because there are no sources. Sometimes we're dealing with old wives' tales and legends, okay? But never trust an unfootnoted site. That being said, don't necessarily trust the footnoted sites either. You've got to check out the footnotes. So, for one of the things the footnote said, historian Alexander Hislop. So I said, okay, well, let's check out Alexander Hislop. Wrote a book called The Two Babylons. Something about proof that, I can't remember what the rest of the title was. But he wrote a book called The Two Babylons. He actually wrote a series of pamphlets back in the 1850s, and they were published as a book later. But what's with this guy, Alexander Hislop? What kind of a historian is he? Well, in researching, I found out he isn't a historian at all. What he was he was a 19th century Scottish reverend, and evidently he devoted his life to tearing down the Catholic Church. Now, don't call me a papal sympathizer, okay? I'm not a papal sympathizer. My grandmother was persecuted by the Catholic Church, okay, when her husband left her with 3 small children in the 1950s. Okay, so no. There's no love lost between myself and the Catholic Church, but I'm a person who deals with truth. And no matter what my feelings against the Catholic Church, they don't enter into biblical archaeology, nor should they, because they're completely unrelated. So, anyway, this guy, he had a vitriolic hatred of the Catholic Church. And he wrote a bunch of pamphlets that were pretty much propaganda. They were hit pieces on the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not going to say everything in his pamphlets was wrong, but a lot of the stuff he just made up. And yes, his book was footnoted. But in going through his footnotes, they were misrepresented. He would often pick and choose the pieces of information and completely ignore pieces of information that would tear down his own theories of what he was saying. So, you know, this isn't hard to find either. Type in Alexander Hislop hoax, and you'll find stuff. You'll find stuff. You'll find that he was completely discredited by the archaeological community and real historians back in the 1920s, I believe it was. Don't quote me on that. I didn't write all this down. Found out what I needed to find out about the guy. I researched it myself, and, you know, really, the guy was all about his agenda, and he wasn't very honest. Just because somebody is religious doesn't mean that hatred can't twist them. As a matter of fact, the more religious we are, the more our hatred twists us. Okay, so what do I do then? This one source that everyone's using from a debunked historian, well, not everyone's using it, the source that everybody's using has been debunked, cannot be trusted. And if a person outright lies and misrepresents one thing, pretty much you've got to throw the source away. There's a difference between being mistaken, okay? Because we're all learning things. I read books by noted scholars, and I'll notice if I read a book by them early on, and I'll say, you know, that's not quite right. Sometimes in the next book they'll say, oh, well, we've learned this. You can't take a book off the shelf that's already been out there. All you can do is in your next book say, or come out with a second edition, but still those first editions are out there. So, you know, we do what we can. Once something's in print, it's out there, so we do the best we can. Anyway, so we have this problem. The source that all these websites are using has been discredited, and there's nothing to it at all. So I decided to, oh, and by the way, I found out through the research that I'm going to take you through that no, Tammuz was not a sun god. He was never resurrected. He never carried a cross around. He carried a branch around in like one thing that I found him in, one carved cylinder seal or whatever that I found him in. He was carrying a branch, and the branch kind of branched like this, but they're curved, not across. It's a branch because, as we're going to find out, he was an agricultural god with a very treacherous wife. So, anyway, weeping for Tammuz. I'm studying Ezekiel 8. I still have to find out what weeping for Tammuz was all about, because right now I have got to throw out the Lent accusation that they were weeping for 40 days, and that became Lent. I've got to throw that out because it came from, it's like the fruit of a poisonous tree. If you like to watch Law and Order or any of those shows, which I used to love to do before I had too much reading to ever watch TV again. Okay. Anyway, so weeping for Tammuz. Still got this. I start going through my sources, and I am really hoping that with my new video making program, I'm going to be able to incorporate in this video. Okay, number one source for finding good articles, jstor.org. That was the first place I went, and I found a bunch of articles. I found out some interesting things about Tammuz. Well, one was that he was an agricultural god. A god that was believed to spend, because of his treacherous wife Inanna, otherwise known as Ishtar, he was forced to spend 6 months in the underworld and 6 months on earth. When he was in the underworld, the rain stopped coming and the sun beat down. So, I mean, it was like he gave relief, okay? He was the agriculture guy. When he was on the earth, everything was growing. When he was gone, you know, there was nothing to protect the earth from the sun, and the sun was beating down, and it made everything brown and crazy, and, you know, no crops, no nothing, and you're just praying for the rain to start again. You're praying for Tammuz to be released from the underworld. So, through a strange series of events, because Inanna sent him down there to take her place, he would spend half the year in the underworld, half the year on earth, and when he was on earth, his poor sister had to be in the underworld for him. Nice family. Well, she was nice. Tammuz's mother and sister were very, very nice. Tammuz, not so much. Inanna, Ishtar, not so much. But that's part of the fun about reading these stories that touch up against the ancient Near Eastern culture of the Bible. You learn some pretty messed up, who was that guy? Geraldo. The guys or Jerry Springer, the guys who were showing up on his show. Man, you could have made their stories into these mythological stories. So anyway, I went on JSTR and I found out something really interesting. Okay, so all these tablets with the story of Tammuz, also known as Dumuzi, it's a shepherd god originally, were dug up at the turn of the century. Okay? And then the tablets, they took half the tablets and they gave them to a university in Istanbul. And they took half of them and they sent them to Pennsylvania. And so we've got these guys and they're translating these tablets and each side only has half. As a result of this, any Tammuz worship, or any Tammuz research done before like 1960, where this guy named Samuel Noah Kramer had been working tirelessly to assemble all the tablets together, all the fragments of Tammuz, and so we get the full story of the death of Tammuz, which really wasn't a death at all. He wasn't killed. He was sent to the underworld, to live there forever, and then, of course, because his sister made a sacrifice for him, for half the year. So we come up against this. Was he resurrected? No, he was never dead. He was living in the underworld half the year. And we would see the cycle of renewal and death with the crops, this was the way of the ancients for describing this way they happened. Well, obviously, the agricultural god who's responsible for this is in the underworld half the year. These guys weren't entirely stupid. Well, they weren't stupid at all. This was actually very clever. Remember, all of ancient Near Eastern paganism, polytheism, henotheism, it is all an attempt to explain what we call today science. They were not scientific. The Bible isn't scientific either. I know people like to use it, but they weren't a scientific people. They didn't think the way we do. So we assume they are, and so we try to take Bible into places that it was never meant to go. It was communicating to a non-scientific people. It was written for us, not to us. If it was written to us, it would all be in science terms and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so now in the 1960s, we've got all the fragments together, and we have a much clearer picture of Tammuz, and I will be sharing that when I do the blog series. And I found that through an article in JSTR written by Edwin M. Yamauchi called Tammuz in the Bible. Now, at that time, he was an associate professor at Rutgers, but he's now a professor emeritus at Miami University. This guy is familiar with or fluent in 22 languages. Are you kidding me? He specializes in ancient Near Eastern studies. He studied under Cyrus Gordon, and if you know anything about the ancient Near Eastern world, Cyrus Gordon is a huge name. I mean, he's not alive anymore. I don't think. Pretty sure he's not. Anyway, so yeah, we've got this guy, and he's got the chops. There were some other articles I pulled up on JSTOR, but they were really very much exploring the relationship between Inanna, Ishtar, and Tammuz, or between the relationship between Tammuz and his mother and sister. His mother, by the way, was not Semiramis. I found that too. Semiramis was a very real queen, 12th century BCE, 12th century historian Centuriathon, I hope I pronounced that right, actually wrote about her. She was a real woman. She was very she is a piece of work, let me tell you, but she was a Babylonian princess married to an Assyrian king, and then to another Assyrian king named Ninus. So she was a real person. Anyway, so I went through that. So on the weeping for Tammuz thing, I'll just kind of, since, you know, I found out he wasn't a sun god. He was never resurrected because he was not dead. He just, you know, sin. He wasn't carrying a cross but a branch and a thing. And the weeping for Tammuz, from what I've been able to find, and a lot of the Tammuz worship stuff we just don't know. We don't know. You know, unless somebody at the Times wrote it down, everything is guessing. And what there are two beliefs. One of the beliefs is that the women were crying sympathetic tears into the ground, wanting for the earth to be revived. That's a theory. Don't quote me on that. Is saying Tyler said that this was the truth. That's a theory. And the people I read it from, that's a theory. They know that they have no proof for that. The other one was all through the epics involving Tammuz, his mother and sister are always weeping for him. So this may have been considered a form of sympathetic worship. The women weeping for Tammuz taking the part of the wife and the mother who were searching the underworld for Dumuzi Tammuz. I searched some other websites. The second website, so the first website that I search is jstor.org. Type in Tammuz, find out what comes in, and I pretty much had to toss an awful lot of the stuff that came out pre-1960, as I said, because we didn't have the whole story. Then, Academia, edu, academia.edu. Used to do spelling bees. Look at the word in my head, I spell it. And then the third site was called Parasay. I can't remember if it's .com or .org. I will make a little poster at the end of here. And I will give you these websites. These are academic websites. Now, I like Parasay and I like academia.edu better than JSTOR because I can actually get PDFs that I can print out. JSTOR is expensive. Now, not necessarily expensive. You can put 3 articles on your bookshelf in there, and they last you for, what, 2 weeks. Okay, and you can read them online. You don't have to pay for them. If you want a hard copy, they cost anywhere between $14 and $30. So, you know, what I do and what everybody at Wisdom and Torah does is not cheap. Okay? And I've got a stack of, oh my gosh, articles this big probably that that either one of us, actually I haven't paid for any yet. I don't know enough about new areas of study yet, but from my co-teachers at Wisdom and Torah Talmudim, where they've gotten articles and they've been kind enough to, I've been able to see them. So I've got this big stack as they've loaned them to me. So these articles are very expensive if you want a hard copy, but, you know, learning things so you can teach is expensive. It's expensive. The people who write these things, this is some of their life's work. It's not like they just sat down like me one day and I wrote a blog, but even my blogs cost me a lot of money individually. So I just want to let you know I am not dissing JSTOR because, you know, they have costs. And the people who did the work, you know, they deserve to have some financial compensation for it. They've got mortgages and families and everything, just like the rest. Anyway, so what did we do today? We had a problem. I had a problem with Ezekiel 8, which led me to investigate an issue. And when I looked online, I saw that the source they were using, I investigated the claims, I investigated the source, found problems with the source. So I had to throw the source out, and I had problems with the author of the source and what he was doing. And then I had to go and look for the real information. In the process of looking for the real information, I found that information before a certain year is going to be incomplete. and it's going to misrepresent the findings. They did the best they could. But pre-1960, remember, they didn't have the whole story. So after 1960, the information is much better, and I was able to clear up a lot of problems. I also took the pictures that were attributed to Tammuz, or the picture that was attributed to Tammuz, found the actual original carving, looked at it, and looked at what archaeology had to say about it. And I was able to clear that up. So it's a matter of not going with what everybody knows, not going with what's on the internet. We need to investigate everything, and we cannot decide that we know something. Okay, I couldn't take anything for granted. I couldn't, all those people who did all those websites, I'm sure that they felt like they'd done research by reading, a book, or, as I've come to find out, a whole bunch of books that were based on this one book that was a poisonous tree. But once we find out a book is a poisonous tree, everything based on it, no matter how well-intentioned, okay, no matter... And this isn't a personal attack about any of the people who wrote this book, okay? They thought that they were doing their due diligence, okay? They read something and they went along with it. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, learning to do research again after so many years out of college is very difficult. I was a aerospace researcher after college, and so I had to do chemical-based research. Learning to do historical research was entirely different, but it involved the same sort of process. When I would do aerospace research, if I had to do something for Boeing or Grumman or McDonnell Douglas, and I was trying something and it didn't pan out, I had to scrap it, okay, sometimes, and start again, instead of just trying to fix what was broken. So when I found out that Alexander Hislop's book was a poisonous tree, I had to scrap it. I couldn't try to salvage it, okay, because what I would end up doing is I would just end up going through his book and finding out what was wrong instead of starting from scratch and finding out what was right. That's research. That is studying scriptural context. And no matter how much we respect a person, or their ministry or whatever, people make mistakes. And people will often assume that somebody has done their homework and that somebody's being honest. But in the case of Alexander Hislop, he wasn't being honest. And so when we trust him just based on the fact that he's a reverend or somebody says he's a historian, he was a reverend who wasn't being honest because he had an agenda. And he wasn't a historian. And so we need to go forward now. And that's the poisonous tree. We don't touch it. But I just told you how to find out people who are doing honest research, that are peer evaluated, who, if they do lie, their buddies in the academic field are going to figure out about it, and they're going to publish papers saying, this guy's full of it. And here's why. And none of them want that. So they're much more likely to be honest. And sometimes when they get something wrong, it'll be because they're legitimately wrong. Okay? Sometimes they'll just have a wrong take on things. But the hard facts are either there or they're not. And that's what I took you through today. I hope that this made sense because I feel like I've been rambling. There are a lot of farm sounds today, a lot of noise, and they've been a little distracting. But anyway, thanks for spending my birthday with me. This is kind of not how I expected to spend it, but I enjoy teaching you how to study scriptural context, and I hope it's been entertaining for you, and I hope you've learned something. Anyway, have a really wonderful day, and don't get discouraged. If you want to know this stuff, it isn't outside of your grasp. This is something you can do. And if you don't want to do it, That's fine. Not everyone has to be a scholar. But as I always say, if you're going to teach, you need to be. You have a responsibility to be. The testimony of Yeshua and the integrity of the commandments hangs in the balance in front of the world we are representing him to. You have a wonderful day. Bye now.